You also said that you were invited by a friend, Barry Weiss?
My friend Barry Weiss.
So this friend works for Twitter, or what is her...
She's a journalist.
Sir, I didn't ask you a question. I'm now asking Mr. Schellenberger a question. Please
Yes, ma'am. Barry Weiss is a journalist.
I'm sorry, sir?
She's a journalist.
She's a journalist. So you work in concert with her?
Yeah.
Do you know when she first was contacted by Mr. Musk?
I don't know.
You don't know. So you're in this as a threesome?
There was many more people involved than that.
Would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show both witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and be seated, please.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting my testimony. In his 1961 farewell address, President Dwight Eisenhower warned of, quote, the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower feared that the size and power of the complex, or cluster, of government contractors and the Defense Department would, quote, endanger our liberties or democratic processes. How did he mean that? Through, quote, domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money. He feared public policy would become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. Eisenhower's fears were well-founded. Today, American taxpayers are unwittingly financing the growth and power of a censorship industrial complex run by America's scientific and technological elite, which endangers our liberties and democracy. I'm grateful for this opportunity to offer this testimony and sound the alarm over the shocking and disturbing emergence of state-sponsored censorship in the United States of America. The Twitter files, state attorneys general lawsuits, and investigative reporters have revealed a large and growing network of government agencies, academic institutions, and non-governmental organizations that are actively censoring American citizens, often without their knowledge, on a range of issues. I do not know how much of the censorship is coordinated beyond what we have been able to document, and I will not speculate. I recognize that the law allows Facebook, Twitter, and other private companies to moderate content on their platforms, and I support the right of governments to communicate with the public, including to dispute inaccurate information. But government officials have been caught repeatedly pushing social media platforms to censor disfavored users and content. Often these acts of censorship threaten the legal protection social media companies need to exist, Section 230. If government officials are directing or facilitating such censorship, notes one law professor, it raises serious First Amendment questions. It is axiomatic that the government cannot do indirectly what it is prohibited from doing directly. Moreover, we know that the U.S. government has funded organizations that pressure advertisers to boycott news media organizations and social media platforms that refuse to censor and/or spread disinformation, including alleged conspiracy theories. The Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington, the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, and Graphica have all inadequately disclosed ties to the Department of Defense, the CIA, and other intelligence agencies. They work with multiple U.S. government agencies to institutionalize censorship research and advocacy within dozens of other universities and think tanks. It is important to understand how these groups function. They are not publicly engaging with their opponents in an open exchange of ideas. They aren't asking for a national debate over the limits of the First Amendment. Rather, they are creating blacklists of disfavored people and then pressuring, cajoling, and demanding that social media platforms censor, de-amplify, and even ban the people on those lists. The censorship industrial complex combines established methods of psychological manipulation, some developed by the U.S. military during the global war on terror, with highly sophisticated tools from computer science, including artificial intelligence. The complex's leaders are driven by the fear that the internet and social media platforms empower populist, alternative, and fringe personalities and views which they regard as destabilizing. Federal government officials, agencies, and contractors have gone from fighting ISIS recruiters and Russian bots to censoring and deplatforming ordinary Americans and disfavored public figures. Importantly, the bar for bringing in military-grade government monitoring and speech countering techniques has moved from, quote, countering terrorism to, quote, countering extremism to countering simple misinformation, otherwise known as being wrong on the internet. The government no longer needs a predicate of calling you a terrorist or an extremist to deploy government resources to counter your political activity. The only predicate it needs is simply the assertion that the opinion you expressed on social media is wrong. These efforts extend to influencing and even directing conventional news media organizations. Since 1971, when the Washington Post and New York Times elected to publish classified Pentagon papers about the war in Vietnam, journalists have understood that we have a professional obligation to report on leaked documents whose contents are in the public interest. And yet in 2020, the Aspen Institute and Stanford Cyber Policy Center urged journalists to, quote, break the Pentagon Papers principle and not cover leaked information to prevent the spread of disinformation. Government-funded censors frequently invoke the prevention of real-world harm to justify their demands for censorship, but the censors define harm far more expansively than the Supreme Court does. Increasingly, the censors say their goal is to restrict information that delegitimizes governmental, industrial, and news media organizations. That mandate is so sweeping that it could easily censor criticism from any part of the status quo, from elected officials to institutions to laws. Congress should immediately cut off funding to the censors and investigate their activities. It should mandate instant reporting of all conversations between social media executives, government employees, and government contractors concerning content moderation. And finally, Congress should limit the broad permission given to social media platforms to censor, deplatform, and spread propaganda. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman for his opening statement. Mr. Taibbi, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman.
Mr. Taibbi, hit that.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the Select Committee, thank you for having me today. My name is Matt Taibbi. I've been a reporter for 30 years and a staunch advocate of the First Amendment. Much of that time was spent at Rolling Stone magazine. Ranking Member Plaskett, I'm not a so-called journalist. I've won the National Magazine Award, the I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism, and I've written 10 books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers. I'm now the editor of the online magazine Racket on the independent platform Substack. I'm here today because of a series of events that began late last year when I received a note from a source online. It read, "Are you interested in doing a deep dive into what censorship and manipulation was going on at Twitter?" A week later, the first of what became known as the Twitter Files reports came out. To say these attracted intense public interest would be an understatement. My computer looked like a Vegas slot machine as just the first tweet about the blockage of the Hunter Biden laptop story registered 143 million impressions and 30 million engagements. But it wasn't until a week after the first report, after Michael Shellenberger, Barry Weiss, and other researchers joined the search of the files, that we started to grasp the significance of this story. The original promise of the internet was that it might democratize the exchange of information globally. A free internet would overwhelm all attempts to control information flow, its very existence a threat to anti-democratic forms of government everywhere. What we found in the files was a sweeping effort to reverse that promise and use machine learning and other tools to turn the internet into an instrument of censorship and social control. Unfortunately, our own government appears to be playing a lead role. We saw the first hints in communications between Twitter executives before the 2020 election, when we read things like "flagged by DHS" or "please see attached report from the FBI for potential misinformation." This would be attached to an Excel spreadsheet with a long list of names whose accounts were often suspended shortly after. Again, Ranking Member Plaskett, I would note that the evidence of Twitter-government relationship includes lists of tens of thousands of names on both the left and right. The people affected include Trump supporters, but also left-leaning sites like Censorship and Truthout, the leftist South American channel Telesur, the Yellow Vest movement. That, in fact, is a key point of the Twitter files, that it's neither a left nor right issue. Following the trail of communications between Twitter and the federal government across tens of thousands of emails led to a series of revelations. Mr. Chairman, we summarized and submitted them to the committee in the form of a new Twitter files thread, which was also released to the public this morning. We learned Twitter, Facebook, Google, and other companies developed a formal system for taking in moderation requests from every corner of government, from the FBI, the DHS, the HHS, DOD, the Global Engagement Center at State, even the CIA. For every government agency scanning Twitter, there were perhaps 20 quasi-private entities doing the same thing. including Stanford's Election Integrity Partnership, NewsGuard, the Global Disinformation Index, and many others, many taxpayer-funded. A focus of this fast-growing network, as Mike noted, is making lists of people whose opinions, beliefs, associations, or sympathies are deemed misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. That last term is just a euphemism for true but inconvenient. Undeniably, the making of such lists is a form of digital McCarthyism. Ordinary Americans are not just being reported to Twitter for de-amplification or deplatforming, but to firms like PayPal, digital advertisers like Xandr, and crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe. These companies can and do refuse service to law-abiding people and businesses whose only crime is falling afoul of a distant, faceless, unaccountable, algorithmic judge. As someone who grew up a traditional ACLU liberal, this mechanism for punishment and deprivation without due process is horrifying. Another troubling aspect is the role of the press, which should be the people's last line of defense in such cases. But instead of investigating these groups, journalists partnered with them. If Twitter declined to remove an account right away, government agencies and NGOs would call reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, and other outlets, who in turn would call Twitter demanding to know why action had not yet been taken. Effectively, news media became an arm of a state-sponsored thought policing system. I'm running out of time, so I'll just sum up and say, it's just not possible to instantly arrive at truth. It is, however, possible, becoming technologically possible to instantly define and enforce a political consensus online, which I believe is what we're looking at. This is a grave threat to people of all political persuasions. The First Amendment and an American population accustomed to the right to speak is the best defense left against the censorship industrial complex. If the latter can knock over our first and most important constitutional guarantee, these groups will have no serious opponent left anywhere. If there's anything the Twitter files show, it's that we're in danger of losing this most precious right, without which all democratic rights are impossible.
This isn't just a matter of what data was given to these so-called journalists before.
This is by far the most serious thing that I've ever looked at, and it's certainly the most grave story that I've ever worked on personally.
I've never worked on an issue where so frequently while doing it, I just had chills go up my spine because of what I was seeing happening. I never thought in my own country that freedom of speech would be threatened in this way, and it's just frightening when you get into it. We first raised a bunch of concerns around the way Twitter pre-Elon Musk was censoring people and creating blacklists. Very quickly, we discovered that we had FBI agents basically and other government officials, demanding that Twitter take certain actions. We now know that the Department of Homeland Security, had tried to create a disinformation board. That went away after public backlash, but we now realize that they have this other enterprise and they've been building out basically mechanisms to proliferate a censorship industrial complex around the country to censor on a whole range of issues. And so you've seen this censorship industry go from, well, we're just fighting ISIS, to, well, we're just fighting Russian disinformation bots, to, well, now we need to fight domestic misinformation, which is just saying we need to fight against people who are saying things we disagree with online. That's all that means. And I mean, it's not a slippery slope. It's an immediate leap into a terrifying mechanism that we only see in totalitarian societies of attempting to gain control over what the social media platforms are allowing. And so, for me, it starts at DHS, but we basically see almost every government agency involved in this.
It's frightening.
A great example of this is a report that the Global Engagement Center sent to Twitter and to members of the media and other platforms about what they called the pillars of Russian disinformation. Now, part of this report is what you would call, I think you would call traditional, hardcore intelligence gathering, where they made a reasoned, evidence-based case that certain sites were linked to Russian influence or linked to the Russian government. In addition to that, however, they also said that sites that, quote, generate their own momentum and have opinions that are in line with those accounts are part of a propaganda ecosystem. Now, this is just another word for guilt by association. And this is the problem with the whole idea of trying to identify which accounts are actually the Internet Research Agency and which ones are just people who followed those accounts or retweeted them. Twitter initially did not find more than a handful of IRA accounts. It wasn't until they got into an argument with the Senate Select Intelligence Committee that they came back with a different answer.
Our Constitution says we will make no law to restrain exactly that kind of free speech.
Yes.
And that includes people who promote the idea that we should redistribute all wealth in a communist type way. As a matter of fact, we still have a communist party in the United States. Isn't that correct?
It is.
Okay, so the limit of free speech historically has been incitement to violence or anarchy, the actual overthrow of a government. Anything other than that is historically covered by the First Amendment.
Yes.
So when we look at the very nature of the State Department funding to affect domestic U.S. speech, was that speech outside the legal bounds? Did it call for insurrection or other criminal activities that would destroy our government?
No, I mean, we did not. I mean, we're not saying that that didn't happen, but we're describing people having political arguments online.
So it's suffice to say that every bit of the speech, or virtually every bit of the speech, whether foreign or domestic online, fell within the normal protections of the First Amendment, and the very act of federal dollars being used to stifle that speech is, in fact, historically what we would consider an indictment against the First Amendment protections.
The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics asserts that journalists should avoid political activities that can compromise integrity or credibility. Being a Republican witness today certainly casts a cloud over your objectivity. But a deeper concern that I have relates to the ethics of how journalists receive and present certain information. Journalists should avoid accepting spoon-fed, cherry-picked information if it's likely to be slanted, incomplete, or designed to reach a foregone, easily disputed, or invalid conclusion. Would you agree with that?
I think it depends.
Really? You wouldn't agree that a journalist should avoid spoon-fed, cherry-picked information if it's likely to be slanted, incomplete, or designed to reach a foregone, easily disputed, or invalid conclusion?
Congresswoman, I've done probably a dozen stories involving whistleblowers. Every reported story that I've ever done across 3 decades involves sources who have motives. Every time you do a story, you're making a balancing test.
Okay.
Between the public
reclaiming
interest.
my time. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I ask you this because before you became Elon Musk's hand-picked journalist, and pardon the oxymoron, you stated this on Joe Rogan's podcast about being spoon-fed information, and I quote, "I think that's true of any kind of journalism," and you'll see it behind me here. "I think that's true of any kind of journalism. Once you start getting handed things, then you've lost. They have you at that point, and you got to get out of that habit. You just can't cross that line." Do you still believe what you told Mr. Rogan? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes.
Good. Now, you crossed that line with the Twitter files.
No.
Elon Musk, it's my time. Please do not interrupt me. Elon Musk spoon-fed you his cherry-picked information, which you must have suspected promotes a slanted viewpoint, or at the very least generates another right-wing conspiracy theory. You violated your own standard, and you appear to have benefited from it. Before the release of the emails in August of last year, you had 661,000 Twitter followers. After the Twitter files, your followers doubled, and now it's 3 times what it was last August. I imagine your Substack readership, which is a subscription, increased significantly because of the work that you did for Elon Musk. Now, I'm not asking you to put a dollar figure on it, but it's quite obvious that you've profited from the Twitter files. You hit the jackpot on that Vegas slot machine to which you referred. That's true, isn't it?
I've also reinvested.
You've made some. No. Is it true that you have profited since you were the recipient of the Twitter files? You've made money. Yes or no?
I think it's probably a wash, honestly.
No, you have made money that you did not have before, correct?
but I've also spent money that I didn't have before. I just hired a whole group of people to
Patently obvious answer, reclaiming my time. Attention is a powerful drug. Eyeballs, money, prominence, attention, all of it points to problems with accuracy and credibility. And the larger point, which is social media companies are not biased against conservatives, and if anything, they ignored their own policies by allowing Trump and other MAGA extremists to post incessant lies, endangering public safety and even our democracy. Hypocrisy is the hangover of an addiction to attention. Now, I want to point out another alleged finding from the Twitter files. Mr. Schellenberger, you've referenced several times this $3.4 million that the FBI paid to Twitter in 2020 that was referenced in General Counsel Jim Baker's email. I first want to confirm that nowhere in the email does Baker say that the money was paid to censor information, take down posts, suspend accounts, or do anything relating to content moderation. Is that correct?
It is.
Thank you. But honest reporting would have explained that the $3.4 million was paid to release information, not censor it. One of my colleagues on this panel repeated your distortions and told Americans this reimbursement was used to, quote, censor certain stories. That's a flat-out lie. Mr. Schellenberger, are you aware of Section 2706 under the Stored Communications Act? It says when social media companies comply with subpoenas, warrants, or court orders, it costs them money, so they get reimbursed. The FBI makes these requests and reimbursements to discover evidence then run relevant to a criminal investigation. Let me repeat that. The FBI makes these requests to help catch the bad guys. That helps keep child predators off social media sites. It helps keep violent criminals off our streets. I support the FBI and our law enforcement agencies. It would be nice if our Republican colleagues did the same and not fabricate explanations for payments that are defined for clear purposes in federal law. My time is just about wrapped up.
May I respond?
But the truth is that social media companies are unregulated monoliths. They pose danger to individuals. They allow posts that bring harm, and that's the bottom line. That the other side will not tell you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman had no time to yield back, but I will let the gentleman, Mr. Schellenberger, respond. And I would also point out that I did not say what the FBI paid Twitter for. All I said was they paid Twitter $3.4 million.
Mr. Chairman, point of order. I didn't ask Mr. Schellenberger a question.
Yeah, but the witness wants to respond, and the witness have been invited to our guests, and frankly, they've been attacked by the federal
government.
Well, please do that. I'm going to let Mr. Schellenberger answer that before recognizing Mr. Bishop.
So are you going to do that as we move down the line of questioners?
The gentleman has not been recognized. You had your 5 minutes, and frankly, I think that's at the discretion of the chair. Mr. Schellenberger, you can respond briefly.
I'll be brief, which is that my understanding from those files is that Twitter had decided not to take that money until recently. So if you read that email, what Stasha, I believe, the person that sent it, is saying is that they started taking money after previously not taking it. And I believe that the reason that they had not taken it earlier was because they did not want that financial conflict clouding their relationship.
Mr. Chairman, the money is payment under federal law so that they can
The gentleman from
costs
North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Material that they've been asked
I thank the gentleman.
That's the bottom line.
Mr. Taibbi, would you care to, I'm down here on this end, sir. Would you care to respond to the attack on your ethics? You weren't given really an opportunity to answer. And if you'd be brief, I've got a bunch of stuff I want to ask you as well.
Sure, just quickly, that moment on the Joe Rogan show, I was actually recounting a section from Seymour Hersh's book, Reporter, where he described a scene where the CIA gave him a story, and he was very uncomfortable. He said that I, who had always gotten the secrets, was being handed the secrets. Look, again, I've done lots of whistleblower stories. There's always a balancing test that you make when you're given material, and you're always balancing newsworthiness versus the motives of your sources. In this case, the newsworthiness clearly outweighed any other considerations, and I think everybody else who worked on the project agreed.
Doesn't it seem like any reporter who breaks a blockbuster story is going to get attention, and there may be even financial consequences that follow? It seems like as surely as the night follows the day, that's the case, right?
That is true, although I would like to clear up, some things that have been misrepresented. Not one of us has actually been paid to do any of this work. We've all, traveled on our own. We've hired our personnel on our own, and I've just hired a pretty large team to investigate this issue out of my own pocket.
The fact that the attempt comes from the dais across the aisle to smear you, frankly, I think liberals, if I understand that, in your background, you're both good liberals, and you come in, and the Democrats' hostility to what you've undertaken is astonishing to behold, but it's part of the picture we're seeing. In Twitter Files number 15, Mr. Taibbi, you exposed Hamilton 68, a website associated with the German Marshall Fund that purported in a dashboard to identify Russian bot networks and became ubiquitously cited by media to identify media stories or narratives that supposedly flowed from Russia. From Russia! You showed that the front man for Hamilton 68 was Clint Watts, a former FBI agent. At Twitter, the trust and safety executives were ridiculing Hamilton 68 for the ludicrous identifications that it was making, which they could reverse engineer and figure out who those accounts were. And then in Twitter Files number 17, after disclosing Mr. Watts' identity, you disclosed that J.M. Berger is the creator of Hamilton 68. And guess what? He was a federal contractor, right?
He was, yes. He denies that he worked on it for the Global Engagement Center, but he was an employee of theirs until about a month before the dashboard's release.
Just a month before it, he said, I believe publicly, that the dashboard was the product of 3 years' work. So doesn't it beg sort of the intriguing question whether the creation of this fraudulent Hamilton 68 dashboard was effectively underwritten by government funding?
Yes, I think that's a good question. Certainly the German Marshall Fund, which is the NGO that is at the top of the chain in this organization. It's the German Marshall Fund, then the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and then Hamilton 68. They're a federal contractor. They received over $1 million from the Department of Defense. They're the board of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, has a former acting head of the CIA, a former deputy head of the NSA, a former chief of the DHS on it. So
I want to make, and the bigger point is hard because the examples sometimes start making it. I want to introduce you to, or introduce the country to somebody else. I think you've mentioned it in one of your writings, Richard Stengel. You know who that is?
Yes, he's the former, the first head of the Global Engagement Center.
I want the American people to hear from him for 30 seconds.
Basically, every country creates their own narrative story. And you know, my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population.
Every country does it. Every country does propaganda, and they have to do it to their own people, is what Mr. Stengel said. If I understand correctly, he was the head of the Global Engagement Center at its creation, right?
He was, and in his book, Information Wars, there are a number of passages where he talks about creating a whole-of-government solution to the information problem. He hastened to say that he didn't want to create a, quote, information ministry, but what he was describing roughly approximates that.
When did you first make contact with Mr. Musk?
I don't know the exact date.
Was it 2020?
It was December. It was December.
December of, well, there's a lot of Decembers in history.
December of last
year.
year.
Which December?
December of last year, ma'am.
Last year, the 22?
Yes.
All right. Now, in your discussion, in your answer, you also said that you were invited by a friend, Barry Weiss?
My friend Barry Weiss.
So this friend works for Twitter, or what is her...
She's a journalist.
Sir, I didn't ask you a question. I'm now asking Mr. Schellenberger a question. Please
Yes,
do
ma'am.
not
Barry Weiss
interrupt.
is a journalist.
I'm sorry, sir?
She's a journalist.
She's a journalist. So you work in concert with her?
Yeah.
Do you know when she first was contacted by Mr. Musk?
I don't know.
You don't know. So you're in this as a threesome?
There was many more people involved than that.
I want to ask you both about the Aspen Digital Hack and Dump Working Group, which involved an 11-day scenario in October 2020 that began with the imaginary release of falsified records, that's what they claim, related to Hunter Biden's controversial employment by the Ukrainian energy company Burisma.
Right.
This was if they knew, because they did know. So I would like your comments, Mr. Schellenberger. These were the files that you did extensive reporting on about how concerning this is and how this is truly the definition of the weaponization against free speech and suppressing accurate reporting.
Yeah, so there's actually two things, and one of them we just discovered recently, which is that there was a Stanford Cyber Policy Institute report which said that, which was in menacing terms telling journalists that they should abandon the Pentagon principle Again, this is the penning on papers principle. This is the idea that if Daniel Ellsberg brings you materials he's taken from the Pentagon about how the war in Vietnam is going, the New York Times and Washington Post published those. That was considered one of the greatest moments of American journalism. Here you have Stanford Cyber Policy Center saying we should abandon that principle. You should instead make the issue about, frankly, the theories about where it might have come from. Then you had the Aspen workshop, which was attended, by the way, by New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, Wikipedia, Facebook, Twitter, many other journalists, where they basically, you read it, it's like a kind of programming of the journalists that they should not follow this long-standing journalistic principle of taking materials from a hack and leak or any other situation and take them seriously. So, you read this and it feels like a kind of brainwashing exercise that Aspen Institute and Stanford were running against American journalists and the social media companies. If there's anything going on here, it tends to be more of a disproportionate blacklisting of more populist voices, or just ideas that we would consider slightly outside of the Overton window, the mainstream opinion at the time. But the Overton window moves. And so the idea that you're just going to narrow the entire what's acceptable on social media to what is mainstream at the time would basically freeze us and not allow the society to progress and for knowledge to grow and for the democracy to function.
With the 14 seconds that I have left, Mr. Taibbi, if you'd like to weigh in on any of this that we have talked about and why this is a direct threat to Americans today, I would appreciate it. Just
quickly, again, we yesterday discovered this email talking about the suppression of people telling their own stories of true vaccine side effects. So these are people who are telling about their own experiences, things that happened to them that are true, and they're being suppressed because what anti-disinformation does is the opposite of what the press does. They are aiming for what the narrative is, and they already know in advance what they're looking for, whereas a journalist goes into a story, does not know what the truth is. We often find that the thing we expect to find turns out to be completely different. They know in advance what they're looking for, and that's why this is so dangerous.